Hey there, Lynn. Good to see your face. Um, Welcome, everybody. We are in the fourth of 5 action planning meetings this week around the strategic. There we go. I always get started right before the recording and give the actual context right before it matters. So if you're watching this recording, I will share again. We're in our fourth of 5 action planning meetings for the Emergency Homelessness Task Force and the strategic plan that we're supporting Deschutes County and the City of Bend and other partners with developing. So we have had 3 other action planning meetings so far. On Monday, we met with folks to talk about what actions are needed within the strategic plan to address the crisis of unsheltered homelessness in the region. We also had a meeting yesterday on expanding services, and earlier today we met regarding the joint office, establishing the joint office and more coordinated, streamlined community-wide efforts to prevent and end homelessness. And so our conversation today is focused on our strategies around affordable housing. And this conversation structured slightly different than conversations we've had so far this week, because there's a bit of, well, to be candid, I noticed in our other meetings that it might be helpful for us to have the milestones in front of us, as well as the strategy that we're doing action planning around. So just a reminder that the milestones that the task force committed to and has proposed are the 4 that are in front of us. And I can read this aloud. I can never tell how easy it is for folks to read the screen or not. Just let me know if you need me to zoom in more. But our milestones, which we're setting out to achieve and hit in the next 5 years, will be that young people and elderly adults experiencing housing instability will have immediate connections to the shelter, support, and services that they need. 150 people experiencing chronic homelessness will be housed and receive ongoing supportive services based on their stated needs. All individuals and families at immediate risk of experiencing homelessness are able to access resources and supports to help them address the crises at hand as needed to prevent them from experiencing homelessness. And services are available to support every person experiencing homelessness in connecting to healthcare, addressing their basic needs in a dignifying manner, navigate crises, and re-engage in the workforce if they're not already and desire to do so. So those are the 4 milestones that we're driving toward with this set of strategies. The strategies are boxed into the next 3 years. That's the commitment we're looking to make as we launch the strategic plan in 2022. The milestones are where we're working toward over the next 5 years. So the reason that those 2 kind of calendars aren't aligned is so that in the next 2 years, we can take a look at these strategies and make sure we're still on track toward hitting the milestones in 5 years. And for folks who haven't been as plugged into the process, those 5-year milestones are intended to drive us toward this 10-year vision that you can see at the top. So again, today's conversation, we are going to zoom into our conversation around affordable housing strategies. This is the framework that the task force offered feedback on in late November. And our purpose here today is both action planning, but also finalizing these strategies. So one of the first questions we're going to ask are these all of the strategies that require a community-wide response in order to drive us toward the vision and to drive toward those 5-year milestones? And from there, we're going to break apart these strategies to say, okay, what actions are required in order to get us there over the next 3 years? So really breaking the strategies down into concrete actions. Over the next month, we'll be finalizing action planning, putting timelines on, et cetera, as the strategic plan gets adopted or confirmed, and that process is still a little bit TBD. But that is all a lot of up top briefing. So I am going to zip my lips here and just ask folks to focus on these 2 yellow boxes at the top, thinking about our vision as well. If you need a link to the Miro board, if you're not able to see it or read, Mickey might be able to forward that to you. But our first question is, are these the strategies that will drive us toward the milestones and vision? Are there any additional strategies that we want to capture here? And are there any edits or changes that we'd want to make to these strategies around affordable housing? So with that, I will open it up to our participants today.
Lynn, what do you think? Not to put you on the spot.
It's kind of the bazillion-dollar question, right? I mean, how do we fix this thing that we as a country have been moving towards for 40 years? I think this is a really good start. Yeah, I mean, I think to me, financing is kind of the critical component. I think we've built sort of a culture of support for affordable housing in the city that seems to be resonating with our developers. And so I think there's a ton of development interest in coming here. I think that for this group, ultimately, whatever land use does, we will have to work around. And so I appreciate that there's not a whole bunch of land use focus in here, because that's important, but also out of our control for the most part. And so I think a lot of times people think land use is the answer because that's an easy political touch point. But we waste a lot of time on that, in my impression. So I kind of appreciate that that's not on the list, even though that's not quite what Brittany's asking. And I think that within that land use, money will help dictate what we can do. So if the state says you may never expand your UGB again, you know, our charge is okay, then how do we build what we need to build within this new framework? And that's where the financing comes in, because ultimately the money that we have will dictate what we can get done. I think we've created sort of the strategy and friendliness to development that it really is about sort of filling that gap. And even land supply, I would attribute to some degree to financing. The more limited the land supply is, the more expensive it becomes. And so that's the objective that we need to overcome, is how do we then finance what we need to finance in this new environment that we're operating within. I would want to see a little bit more on what the group was talking about on eviction policies, just because I'm curious. I think that's another one that can easily be a political touch point on either side. And so just developing that out with some specificity might help us get to the root of what those issues are and be very clear without it becoming too much of a sort of ping pong session, if that makes sense. And then I guess my question, and Brittany, I'm sorry I didn't ask you this when we prepped for this yesterday or whenever it was I'm assuming that ownership for these strategies is not necessarily assigned to any one entity at this point. In some cases it is, but not always. And what I'm thinking about is rent assistance. We have not engaged in providing our own rent assistance historically because it just doesn't make sense with the sort of financing that we have available. And it has been covered elsewhere. Let's just leave it at that, I'll say. We know it hasn't been completely covered. And so I guess with that one, thank you, Patty. That was perfect timing. Well done on covering the rent assistance. So I guess that's really my question with that is I'm assuming that that is not sort of being assigned to the city or the county or the joint office or whatever. It's just that this is a strategy that we believe in. I can endorse that. I would maybe have some questions if this was in some way getting assigned to anybody specifically that wasn't Patty Wilson.
I think that, yeah, because our rental assistance is either through the COC or, you know, the state of Oregon. And OHCS is, you know, it's uncertain whether we'll continue funding through them. It's a year-to-year, day-to-day changing thing. So, you know, our regular allocations that we traditionally get through OHCS for rental assistance, are, you know, frankly, it's not very much money. And so the last few years, of course, it's been all this extra COVID money. Mm-hmm. And OHCS is moving towards having a third-party contractor do it instead of the local communities. So, you know, we'll see what happens in the next few years. And we'll have plenty of rental assistance available through different sources through 22 and part of 23. But after that, you know, at one point, the COVID money will dry up.
And Patty, remind me, what was like the EHA budget before, like pre-COVID? Was it, I can't remember what it was for this region.
Let me see
I'm
if-
sorry to put you on the spot like that. I'm just thinking like rent assistance budget for neighbor impact for this region pre-COVID. And I should know this, but I don't.
Well, okay,
We
so
managed to
rapid
forget it all.
rehousing, I know current rapid rehousing for youth, we only get 77,000 a year.
Mhm.
Everyone else, 350,000. And then we have some PHS veterans, which is only about 47,000. I'd have to, let me pull the EHA budget. I think it's about 300, but I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
And then the rest of our, our HTBA is, spent in conjunction with DHS child welfare. So we're not talking huge numbers.
Yeah.
And we're not even up to $1 million.
I wonder if this is, so I think that that's really helpful, particularly the time limited nature of recent rental assistance. And you had a question before that, Lynn, that I am sure I will remember in just a second. But around rental assistance, I wonder this strategy was kind of added on, I think, late in the process. And I wonder if this is one that we would actually want to open up to be more broadly about housing assistance, to bring in Housing Works and public housing assistance and making sure that that is being leveraged to prevent homelessness and encourage folks or expand the realities in which folks can afford to live and work in Bend. So taking it one step away from rental assistance and more broadly to housing assistance programs are accounting for the needs of people experiencing homelessness, potentially prioritizing them, and including that here as well. Would that track as the right edit potentially for this strategy?
Yeah, and I'm thinking it's really just about stability, housing stability and rent assistance generally. So and I'm sorry, because I have not been at all of the discussions. And so if I'm blowing something up here, you guys can ignore me. But I think that what it is it's the stability of keeping people in homes so that they're not falling into homelessness. And it's also returning people to stable housing as quickly as we can. And so to me, it's about stability and not necessarily whether we call it rent assistance or something else. I get that the sort of finance side of this is important. That's a key consideration here versus just sort of having access to casework, for instance, or caseworker. But yes, I like how you frame that a little bit better. Thank you.
And eviction, I hear you on eviction policies. And I think as we dig into that action today, we can get a little bit clear about what folks are hoping to see, or maybe the research that needs to be done in order to get clear on what's needed for improvement around eviction policies. Great.
Data is a critical missing component for sort of the eviction discussion generally, in my opinion. We just don't have all the info we need to, I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but I like to look at data in determining policy when we can, and it's not always possible, but anyway.
Yeah, our EHA typically runs 300, give or take 50,000 or so.
Any other feedback on this set of strategies, whether we feel like this is the work that it'll take in order to get to our five-year milestones, our best guess of this being the work required over the next 3 years? Lynn, I just remembered your other question around responsibility as I was saying that, and it's an important clarification, that this is intended to be a community-wide strategic plan that the joint office, that's a currently proposed structure that we met earlier today to talk a little bit more about, but that the strategic plan will be led and implementation will be led by the joint office. But that can also just mean that the joint office is supporting other partners when they're the the lead for some of these strategies as well, but it is intended to be a community-wide strategic plan. So it's not putting anyone specifically on the hook for strategies unless we're clear that it's something that the joint office alone will lead, or the joint office will clearly support X partner in implementing, et cetera. So that's kind of the level of specificity that we're at in action planning.
That's perfect. And I think, my biggest concern on that is sort of competition, perceived competition, is that I think historically the city has felt very good when our partners are doing the work that they can, and we will back up that work to the best of our ability, and we'll fill in gaps, I think, when we can. But I have no interest in competing with folks who are interested in doing this work. I'll say that. So I think there's plenty of clients. It's just there's limited funding, and so that's sort of where that statement came from more than anything. If structures change, always reevaluate, but that's where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Great. All right, last call for any suggestions, questions, modifications to the set of strategies before we start action planning around them. Okay. Patty, did you? Okay. Sorry, I couldn't tell if you were jumping in there for a sec.
Oh, no, I'm just walking along.
Thanks. Okay. So we'll move into our first strategy here, integrating and prioritizing the community's 10-year vision into all affordable housing opportunities and planning and project local housing gaps through 2032. So this is intended to, I think the intent behind this strategy is that we need to be accurately projecting the need for 0 to 30 AMI and housing for people experiencing homelessness into all affordable housing development planning processes across the community. If we're not accounting for those needs, they're not going to be met. If we're not planning toward them, the housing isn't going to appear out of thin air. So I'm curious if folks have additional planning that you would want to see integrated here. This is, I think, a bit of a draft list. If there's other places where we want to make sure we're capturing the community's vision and the need for affordable housing in projections and planning. Is there anything else we need to list here, or processes, mechanisms, partnerships? It may be that different committees need to be working together, or different partners that are working together now in order for this to truly be a comprehensive approach together.
Could someone refresh my memory on the definition of affordable housing? And does that include like workforce housing, or is it just 30% and below?
So for City of Bend, I can tell you our definition. I don't know that that's what the joint office is going to take on, but I do think we track pretty closely with HUD in terms of how they fund, maybe not how they define. And that is for rental housing, 60% AMI has to be affordable for 60% AMI or under, paying no more than 30% of gross each month. For ownership product, it's 80% of AMI and under.
80%.
And then we have a specific fund that we set up. The new CET is for 30% AMI and under. So we kind of, everything above 61% or 81% AMI, we call middle income housing. And that's up to about 120% AMI.
So that wouldn't ever be in one of these plans.
The middle income?
Yeah.
I mean, the comprehensive plan is sort of the citywide land use plan. And so we talk about sort of like housing affordability generally in there, as well as that's where our definition for affordable housing lives. And then the HNA and HCA, yes, that is what that is. It's all the projected housing need for the 20-year period, planning period, by income level, more or less. So that is what, like, a lot of folks have seen the regional housing needs analysis that COIC did. That's sort of their version of this. This is actually HNA, and the housing capacity analysis, as it's now called, is something that we are required to do on a certain frequency. And that's what helps trigger a UGB expansion or other work around that if we find that in our 20-year planning period, we do not have enough land for the type of housing that we think we need. So I'm oversimplifying, but so yes, that one also does. I mean, it's not, if we determine through data that there is a specific need for, say, middle income housing, that will absolutely be discussed at length in that plan, et cetera. So.
If I could chime in, I'm just wondering if part of the strategies would here include middle income housing, given the parallel with what we've talked about in other groups as far as like, I forgot the verb we used, strengthening the service provider systems and supporting the workforce of service providers. And it feels like that, I don't know where it would fit in here either as like a sub strategy or one of the larger strategies. And then unrelated, while I have the floor, I have kind of a half-baked thought that I'm hoping somebody who's more versed in this could fully bake. But should there be any strategies on the demand side? Like I see a lot of supply side strategies. And yeah, I guess like I don't know a whole lot about what that could look like in this context, but I just wanted to ask the question to the group if anything on the demand side would make sense to include here in the strategies.
Lynn, I'm looking to you.
I really wanted to jump in, but I was not. I've been like controlling the floor a lot, so I was hoping somebody else would if they wanted to. I think demand side, so we can't say no to like building permits and things like that. Most people know this. Demand side strategies that I'm thinking about are things like a vacancy tax, right? Let's remove the incentive to leave your house vacant all day, all year, whatever it is. Things like that, I think, may be an approach on the demand side. The evictions is a demand side thing also, potentially. I kind of categorize it as that. I think there's various other strategies like that could be, not all of them are within our control, obviously, but I don't think that needs to be a limitation at this point in what we talk about. But I think that's a really good point, Colleen. I joke with our lobbyist about like our strategy this year should be lobbying the state of California to build more housing. We don't have as many people coming here. Anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn.
And on middle income housing, particularly for social service providers, I think that's something that I don't know that I have a response to as far as where it lives or what it can look like. I'm not sure if there are targeted strategies that we might be able to consider. And to the point earlier of the city's kind of broader definition of affordable housing being at 60% AMI. And, you know, my sticky here is at 0 to 30% AMI. And that I would love to get into that to figure out how to support the city in prioritizing 0 to 30 AMI or even 0 to 40 AMI, and see what that, I'm curious, Lynn, what you think that could look like, even if we were to suggest that the joint office almost be tasked with prioritizing 0 to 30% AMI development with all of its partners. And I wonder if that's kind of the degree of separation that a joint office affords us that's helpful, or if that just means that we have too many people working at cross purposes with different priorities. I'm not sure.
So first, sort of on the workforce housing type thing, I mean, to me, the sort of goal there is we're increasing capacity of service providers. That's our overarching process, and a strategy to help those people obtain housing is one of the sort of subsets. That's sort of how I'm processing it in my brain, because there are other things that I think we could do. I mean, Councillor Schenkelberg the other day was talking about increasing pay for mental health professionals. What is or isn't feasible, I don't know. I'm not the judgment on that, but I think that there's a lot of things that we could do to kind of form that package. Whether it lives here in the plan or not, I don't know. But anyway, I do think that increasing service capacity is something we need to focus on as well. On the 30% AMI thing, yes, I think in my perception, that is absolutely sort of the forgotten population to most of Bend. Or the county, in some cases intentionally. And so to me, having a laser focus on that population is going to be critical to making a difference. I do think that most affordable housing, not even I think, most affordable housing in Bend right now that's getting constructed is for the 60, 50, 80% AMI level. It's not for the 0 to 30. And if we want to make progress on 0 to 30, we have to have very deliberate strategies and a very deliberate focus on that. Because what we have seen is we've been extraordinarily productive on those higher affordable income levels and not at all productive on this lower end. So I do agree. I think that to me is kind of the gold star in all this is, yep, this is what we really, really need to tackle. And just for a reminder for this group, household of 4 with 1 wage earner, full-time minimum wage is 30% AMI. So that's a pretty broad swath of the population that we're talking about with that, that is not being effectively served right now. I don't know if that helped answer what you were looking for. My team may also have some thoughts on this. I'm kind of monopolizing, but I think, Amy, we hired specifically to manage the 30% AMI fund. There's not a ton of revenue in that yet. And so we've been redeploying her in every possible number of ways we can until that money continues to build up enough to deploy. But, Amy and Rachel may have some other thoughts too.
And I apologize, I was multitasking and I have reached an age where apparently I can't do that anymore. So that ship has sailed.
Amy, thoughts on whether the joint office should sort of laser focus on 30% AMI or?
No, I don't think, and perhaps I'm going in the exact opposite direction of my boss, who's also on this call. But I would say if there is a laser focus, then sometimes we lose part of the audience or part of the community as far as support. We may talk about that behind the scenes, but I think it has to be broader to engage other parts of the community.
I don't know yet that disagreeing with me is okay. Like,
okay,
this is good. This is good. This is what leads to good discussion.
Exactly, because my question for you, Lynn, and I'm curious, Amy, what you think is, what would it look like for the joint office as a place that is helping all of the partners at the table, the community, the county, the city of Bend, potentially the city of Redmond, other cities in the region, integrate and prioritize this 10-year vision into all planning, takes it while, the city of Bend may be a part of the governing structure of the joint office. What would it actually look like? What would the actions look like for that kind of internal advocacy of advocating for the 0 to 30% AMI need? Because to be candid, we're not getting to 2032 with eliminating housing stability without that kind of across the board, and recognizing that the city of Bend can't drop everything above 40% AMI to solely prioritize the deepest need, but also that there's an impact on growth and the workforce if there's not a prioritization in there. So I'm curious I'm just curious how that sits, what that relationship would be like, or what that internal advocacy would look like.
Well, I think that the city of Bend has put that 30% and under at the forefront of a lot of our decisions by putting the additional construction excise tax in place. I think by making that a priority, we're having those discussions, we're moving forward, and most importantly, perhaps we're putting dollars into those programs, sustained dollars that will help support permanent supportive housing. And And I think that just shows the commitment of the council and the city to keep those conversations moving forward and to shore up those services and our partners across the community. And it would be terrific to encourage other communities and other bodies of government to take that same action.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm also curious where Housing Works fits in here when it comes to prioritizing at this income level. What 0 to 30% AMI housing looks like beyond just permanent supportive housing, right? Just deeply affordable housing. And I'm curious, we're kind of moving a little bit into the second action, but I'm curious what folks think is needed there in order to support them in bringing more 0 to 30% online, and particularly prioritizing people at risk of or experiencing housing instability and homelessness.
Brittany, is there somebody from Housing Works on the call that can talk a little bit about the relationship between the Housing Choice Voucher, VASH vouchers, rapid rehousing, those connections?
They weren't able to make it.
I might be able to speak to this. I think you just have to set aside the vouchers, similar to just setting aside whatever revenue stream that you want to target to that 30% AMI population and below. You just have to set aside some vouchers. And beyond vouchers, whether that's, set aside apartments in your LIHTC units, you just have to set aside a number. And I think it's just figuring out what that number is and striking the right balance to make sure that we're not refusing housing at all income levels.
Sorry, can you say that the last part? We're not
refusing housing at all income levels. It needs addressing 30% AMI and below is a critical need right now, but it doesn't mean that the other needs don't go away.
Right.
There needs to be, I like to describe it as chutes and ladders. There needs to be ladder rungs at every level for people to access housing.
I think it would be interesting to understand that of the housing choice vouchers that are available to the Tri-County area right now, and I believe it's around 1,400, but I'm not sure how many of those are leased up and what percentage based on income that lease up represents. And so then we'd be able to determine if it's the 30% and under folks that are unable to secure housing, or if it's more if it's across the spectrum. And what are those barriers for those other folks, those 300 vouchers that cannot lease up? Especially when Housing Works owns the largest portfolio of affordable housing on this side of the mountains.
So I'm going to try to capture that here. Yeah, go ahead. And then I may need you to correct me, Amy, if I don't capture this right.
I was going to change the subject a little based on something that Rachel said. I mean, same topic, but so I don't know if we want to get the sticky down first, maybe.
And Brittany, I don't have enough information to say that that's a Housing Works needs to figure that out, or if as a community, we need to figure that out.
I'm sure they probably have that data.
I would think so.
They would, I'm sure they do. We just don't have it readily available today.
And as to that, how as a community can we support leasing up? I think where Housing Works does come in is landlord engagement. As one of the biggest landowners, it comes down to landlord engagement which I think is something that'll bridge today's conversation and the community engagement conversation tomorrow. But if any actions around landlord engagement, I know that HLC just got funding through COIC or COHC, now I can't remember, to build out the landlord engagement program. Colleen, am I mixing that up with the funding that Fuse actually got?
Yeah, so Fuse was also funded, we were funded through Pacific Source for a 2-year pilot to develop a landlord engagement and retention program. And we're passing through like 15,000 of that to Housing Works for them to hire a specific landlord liaison position. And then the HLC was also funded by the Central Oregon Health Council, not COIC, but very similar acronym, to fund some of the same landlord liaison position.
Okay.
And I think there's been comparable, like Covo had a landlord engagement person for a while. And did Neighbor Impact, or did that not come to be? I don't know. There's been various other sort of efforts, just not as targeted maybe as the Fuse position and things like that.
Yeah, we had one for a while, and maybe we just didn't have the right person. Then we lost funding, went through that funding and haven't found new funding.
So going backwards a step to what Rachel said, which is the chutes and ladders comment and getting 30% AMI housing done. And I think that what that made me think of is we need that variety of housing income levels in order to develop 30% housing projects generally, not completely, but generally. And the reason is that you need somebody to pay rent in order to keep the building operational. And so the 30% people cannot pay much, if anything. So you need sort of those higher income levels sometimes in order to sort of accommodate and keep the building moving forward without an extraordinary amount of subsidy. So that's something that I think is important. We as a community have tried to set goals around like, we're gonna do all 30%. And we even have an expansion area within our UGB expansion that is designated to have 25% of all residential units being at 30% AMI and under, and they cannot make that pencil. I mean, the entire annexation area is unable to be annexed right now because they can't meet that 30% AMI need, because that is such an extraordinary amount of 30% AMI housing. And I've had a ton of developers look at it and meet with the owners and try to figure out like, and what I've said is, tell me what you need. Like, don't put any limits. Just tell me what you need to make this happen. And everybody's like, we can't make this happen. So I do think that having that scaling is important. New change out of the 2016 tax code is allowing for income averaging in LIHTC projects, which is a really big deal. So that has not yet been used in Bend, but we are altering our code and strategies to allow for it to happen here slowly, very slowly. But that does allow for 30% AMI units to be built in tax credit projects in exchange for some 80% AMI units. So it's typically like 2 to 1. So that's important, I think, in sort of incentivizing some of that 30%, and it broadens the audience, which is typically not an issue here in Bend. We have plenty of potential residents, so people don't really worry about that. But if that ever changes, having income averaging helps. The other thing that I think is a concrete action that I have testified to the state on, and I don't know if they're listening at all, is allowing for mixed income tax credit projects. So right now it is very, very challenging to do anything above 60% or 80% if it's an income averaging project using tax credits. And the theme here is we don't want these public subsidy funds to go towards people who aren't worthy, right? Or who make too much money. I get it. At the same time, the same principles are in place for getting 30% AMI units in a market rate project as they are in an income averaging project. Having those higher income levels in there helps subsidize the building overall and allows for some of that lower income development to happen. So I think anything we can do to bring mixed income in and try to incentivize that way is just going to be helpful overall at getting units on the ground, and makes it a little more, I mean, very few tax credits are not really something that most people want to work on. It's very complex, but I think having that opportunity out there allows for a little more breadth in our development community.
Mm-hmm.
Colleen or Rachel, does Housing Works still just mainly do a lottery system for the bulk of their vouchers, or has that changed? I seriously don't know.
Yeah.
That's the same as far as I know.
I was going to say the same as far as I know, except that there are like some subcategories for different types of vouchers, like the family reunification or the mainstream versus the housing choice voucher, and now the emergency housing voucher. So it sounds like there's separate pools for different lotteries within those vouchers. And then some mechanism of prioritization within that as far as like residency in Central Oregon, disability status, I believe, but I don't have a whole lot more info.
I also just want to speak to a little bit, like Lynn touched on this about, and I'm just going to use an organization as an example that has received funding, and I've tried to help guide through the funding they've received is, the small affordable housing developers percent work to maintain their buildings of some sort. And so the Covos, the St. Vincent de Pauls, like the really small organizations that have all good intentions, really struggle years down the road after they've received funding if they have committed to those lower AMI levels.
And so I think that's a really good segue into we've been getting here, but financing and funding around the community's 10-year vision. I think the theme across the rest of the conversations is that there is not enough funding. The rest of the conversations this week is that for both supportive services and affordable housing, there is not enough funding out there to stand up and support what needs to be done. And I think since we began this process, there have been conversations about developing new or additional revenue streams or leveraging new revenue streams. So some of the yellow stickies that you see here are reflective of some of those ideas. I'm curious if there are other tools that we'd want to put on the table, and I'll have a second question after that. But for now, I'm curious if there are other tools that we'd want to put on the table that could address concerns like what you raised, Rachel, around maintenance for some of these housing programs and ongoing costs, or additional revenue streams or funding streams that we'd want to lift up here.
I think that one low-hanging fruit that others understand better than I do, have to admit, is if there could be some kind of rental study done in order to justify increasing our voucher allocation from HUD. And I don't think I'm using quite the right terminology, but I think that the HUD fair market rent amount that's allowed for the vouchers and for financing properties is a lot lower than the reality is here. So I think the action item associated with that would probably be for the joint office to fund or figure out what Housing Works needs to conduct or fund one of those rental studies.
That is, so I've added that here, and that's a maybe a question for Housing Works, but also a question that I can bring to some national partners. This is the conversation in every city, unfortunately, right now, of FMR is a number that makes sense in exactly 0 cities, I believe. Certainly 0 medium to large cities. So I'm not sure if the rental subsidy strategy or the rental study strategy is exactly what's needed, or if this is something that falls in a broader bucket of national advocacy that's happening. But I appreciate you raising that. Lynn, I'm curious if you or others.
It's a thing. You can do it. Portland's done it. Their housing authority. It's a 3-year window where you can get an increase to your FMR. And I can't remember, it's been a while since I've looked at the formulas, but yes, you can get an increase to your FMR by doing this study. So it makes sense. I think Portland's on their second round right now, maybe, if I'm remembering correctly. I can't remember if it's Metro or I think it's just Home Forward does the study for all the areas they serve. Housing Works has been somewhat resistant to do this in the past. It takes money, it takes work, you know, and it only lasts for a few years. But I will tell you, upon having a number of conversations with Senator Merkley's staff and Senator Wyden's staff, Senator Merkley in particular has absolutely attempted to disband the FMR office in HUD and has been completely unsuccessful. And the strategies that he has taken, like he has absolutely narrowed in on FMR being an issue. And has been like, I was kind of shocked that HUD was like strong arming the senator, you know, in this way and saying like, sorry, we're just going to carry on, because I didn't think that could like happen for long, but it is. There's like 3 dudes in a room and they're the FMR team and they make this stuff up, and they are like untouchable by Congress, which is fascinating to me. And so Merkley's tried to completely cut their budget off and things, and then HUD has reallocated money to them. Like it's kind of a soap opera. So I don't think that I think that our representatives are cued into that and will be doing what they can. I don't think Merkley's going to drop that one. But I do think that although the rent study is kind of just a Band-Aid, that's the strategy we have in our control right now. And so I'm not saying don't argue against FMR. I think we all should, but I do think the Band-Aid is what we have to work with. And so it's worth considering. That was a lot of info, sorry.
No, that's
I just think it's
helpful.
funny, like the FMR
That's
guys.
helpful.
I kind of want to figure out who they are and find
Yeah.
them.
And
I'm concerned that's how government works across the board, is just 3 guys in a room,
Yeah.
you know, making decisions.
Self-preservation.
and I will speak that Housing Works has done this before in my 20 years of living here. It's just over the past few administrations of Housing Works, they have not been willing to do this.
And so again, this may be a place where we're recommending that the joint office support and offer capacity, even if it's strategizing around the funding and resources needed, as the joint office seeks to identify sustainable funding for itself. Supporting partners in implementing some of these strategies will be part of that. And I wonder if that's the framing for this, that the joint office work to support and remove barriers for Housing Works as they look at, we have limited capacity. This is going to change the program for just 3 years. What would it look like to actually say, no, we'll make a 5-year commitment to the study so that we have the second study, similar to Portland, getting into round 2, if that's possible.
My only hesitation would be, unless we can determine why there are delays in lease up or a problem with that 20% of vouchers not being utilized in the Tri-County area, that's got to be the first step. Because if we're asking for more, or if we're asking to fund to ask for more, how can we not be using 20% of the vouchers?
I think that the change in FMR would allow, or am I misunderstanding?
So what it is that if I believe there are 1,400 housing choice vouchers and its derivatives, but people have been unable to lease up or achieve and sustain housing up to that number. So there's approximately 300 households that haven't been able to use their housing choice voucher. So if we're asking for more vouchers, but we're unable to utilize the allocation that we have for the Central Oregon area, it seems like a pitfall.
It's not an ask for more vouchers, though. It's an ask to raise the rent so that vouchers can apply to places that charge more.
Then I think you have to still correlate it to that inability to lease that. And isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah,
we have
and
to,
Rachel, I think that the FMR is one component, right, Amy? It's also that there may be other strategies we could look at that would make it easier for people who are selected in the lottery to actually obtain housing. Because if not, that voucher is, unused, and that's money that we're leaving on the table. Is that right, Amy? Did I capture that? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, we definitely have to be at our best practices before we can make that pitch, I think.
Mhm.
Also, I just think one of the challenges with being able to lease up those vouchers is the low FMR rate. So if they can't pay the extra on top, then I think that that's been one of the barriers to leasing up.
Absolutely.
Sorry, my internet is really poor. I'm going to keep myself on mute.
That's okay. We could hear you okay. For what that's worth. Rachel, you went in and out earlier, speaking of connections, but you've been fine since. So I hear what you're saying, Amy, as far as making sure that it's also a priority to maximize utilization and potentially for the joint office or other community partners to be supporting Housing Works in both identifying those barriers and removing them, as we're also looking at supporting a rental study in order to get the AMR adjustments. Okay. All right. We went deep there, and that is exactly what we're looking for here, which I appreciate. Other thoughts on additional funding and financing tools that we want to think about tapping into community-wide?
I would like to say sort of all things, like, you know, there's a whole bunch of other sort of revenue mechanisms that are not on this list. And so I'm feeling a little limited in that we can't list every single thing. But right now we have some Ben general fund going towards housing and homelessness. That's not on the list. Where is the county's general fund? Where is, you know what I mean? So like, but I don't want to just say general fund. I think it's broader than that. That is a sticky, but I think it's just sort of like evaluating all unrestricted revenue sources within our control for what makes sense. And if we are serious about this as a priority, that's what we do for transportation planning, right? We're looking at every source. And so I think we need to look at things in the same way here. Similarly, I don't see sort of tax reform on here, but I think that's a very broad topic. And I think that there are sort of tax possibilities that may or may not even need state law change that are potential. So tax reform is a big issue, and that is, oh my goodness, we could not lead that, nor could the joint office. Like, that's not within the realm of possibility, but there may be some local tax options that would be. So yeah, so I think tax reform is broader than just that statement, but I'm thinking that's probably the better way of phrasing it. It's just tax reform.
And would you say, to try to get more specific, would that be tax reform options for funding and financing affordable housing broadly and leave it at that level, or housing specifically for people experiencing homelessness?
I kind of think broadly, and just mostly because I'm not the policymaker. And the winds change, right? Right now, 30% AMI is a really big deal, and we need to focus on that. But in 15 years, let's hope that we have made a significant dent in that, and we need to really focus on something else. So that's where I'm thinking, if you create revenue structures, I like to keep them as broad as is politically palatable so that we can have some flexibility when we need it. That's just me, though.
I also wanted to add something about development incentives. I know the city is really generous with SDC waivers. And if other entities like Ben Parks and Rec were able to consistently give the same waivers, or just having that as part of their ongoing funding plan. Oh, I'm sorry, Brittany, SDC, System Development Charges, not hard.
Yeah, no apology needed from you. I'm not sure where I got that. As you reset it, I was like, yep, those were the words used. Great. Any other tools either?
I know that's kind of minutia, and there's probably other tools encompassed in there.
I'm looking through, the city is considering the property tax exemptions as well.
So I wonder if it's helpful, like when I talked to council a while ago, we sort of created 4 strategy sort of buckets of things that council could do. One was, increase revenue. That's how we fill the gap. One was reduce regulatory burden, which typically saves time, which then can save costs. One is reduce regulatory cost. And then there's this sort of other bucket. And so I think all of those first 3 make sense. We can look at revenue, and that's one way of doing it. And that's vital for affordable housing. We need that. But we also need to be looking at what burdens we can remove and what fees we may be able to, or costs we may be able to decrease as well. And I think that that's where we're going to get to the most robust answers when we do all the things. So thanks, Amy, for saying that, because that's what sort of between the SDC waiver, that's in that reducing regulatory cost, and so is fees, sort of all of these things. Tax exemptions are one of the ways to do that. So there's lots of different things that can fit within each of those sort of reduce regulatory burden or reduce fees strategies. That might be too high level that I'm just saying, but just to keep it even more than what this small group is going to come up with in an afternoon.
Yeah. And so is that a suggestion to rephrase, to make this strategy actually more broader and have more space inside it? Or is exploring that an action that can be undertaken under this strategy? Sorry, that's maybe a weedy question.
I think that what Colleen and Amy just said should stay on the stickies. And I think we also go beyond that by exploring other regulatory fees and barriers or something like that. I don't know.
Gotcha. And I think I want to recognize that this conversation is very focused on the city of Bend, given the experts we have on the call, which I'm very grateful for all of your time. And this, what you just named, Lynn, could create space for us to get a little bit more granular at the county level and with other cities that sign on to the strategic plan and commit to the strategic plan. That it's, the way that we were talking about it earlier today is that it's also a commitment to these actions. So it's encouraging, beyond Bend Parks and Rec, those types of waivers. What would that look like in other cities in the region?
Just one more quick tool that does sometimes cost money and not cost money is expedited permitting across all the cities, as well as the county, is a powerful tool when arranging funding. And I know the city of Bend has a pretty robust program to make that happen that we'd be happy to share.
Great. We haven't mentioned the affordable housing bond, which has come up in a few of our conversations. Hearing loud and clear that there is revenue building, there are regulatory options to remove barriers and limits. The affordable housing bond feels like the big revenue generation place. I'm curious if there is energy, interest in a recommendation here or an action here around exploring what it would take to support an affordable housing bond, or recommending that the joint office actually be a place that is a think tank for helping develop that, or leverage its partners to develop that. What would be needed there to make that a reality, or to start the exploration at least?
This is where I was hoping Councilor Perkins would jump on and be like, yes.
I am here. Sorry, I'm multitasking. Yes. There.
That was exactly right. Thank you. No, I don't want to put words in the councilor's mouth, but without a doubt, I could see this being extraordinarily useful for meeting our goals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for humoring me, Megan.
And I think that tax reform as a sticky here, which I have lost, exploring local tax reform options. Along with this, maybe something to raise in the community engagement conversation tomorrow as well. We've talked a lot about public education. And these things often go hand in hand. When folks have a big ballot measure on, there's suddenly a lot of education about the issue. Here it's happening in the reverse, where folks recognize that we need to be doing community engagement and public education. And so thinking about what comes next from that public education, maybe public support and advocacy around an affordable housing bond. And so there may be some threads to tie, or some pieces to put together there. And we can think about, well, I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on how the joint office could be most helpful in supporting something like that. Is it thought partnership? Is it data gathering? Is it leveraging the partnerships across the homeless service sector for support for that kind of initiative, for a bond ballot initiative? Curious if anyone has thoughts. If not, again, it's something that we can keep working on. We can fine tune this action offline.
I mean, I would just say that following the way that the transportation bond that just passed, how that came about, how they engaged the public and got it passed during, in the height of the pandemic. I think following the lessons learned from that, I think is something that we would want to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Great. Great. Okay. All right, last call on financing and funding levers, opportunities that we want to build in here, either exploration or more clear commitments and actions like a few of the others that we've talked about. Some of these feel like as we put the exact verbs on them, they're going to change and look a little bit different. So that's a part of what I'm getting at, is that there could be more opportunities to explore that we haven't named, or specific actions of revisiting the prioritization or how unrestricted funds are allocated and prioritized and used.
So I have one more sort of item for this, and I'm not really quite sure how to frame it, but it has to do with sort of state level advocacy. And I think that Central Oregon has been very successful in maybe the last 5 to 8 years on advocating for ourselves and sort of what our share is, if that makes sense. So that needs to continue without a doubt. But the component of that I think may be appropriate for the joint office is kind of the data. And I hammer this so hard, so you all probably have heard me say this. We are growing more quickly than the data can account for. or by the time it's published, we are out of date. And so I think that the state level advocacy is also ensuring that the unique needs of this region are being reflected in how those decisions are being made. Because we are growing so quickly, our needs are a little bit different than some of the other needs in the state. Similarly, they have other needs that we do not. And so just ensuring that sort of the uniqueness of Central Oregon is represented effectively in Salem for existing funding that is already, could be allocated differently or more or something like that. So I just want to make sure that that's still on the radar, although it's pretty broad.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really helpful. So often you all, and when I say you all, I mean Central Oregonians, talk about the unique nature of the region and that fast growth. I really appreciate the way that you frame that fast growth in contrast to other regions' needs, that it may not be growth focused. And that I think really helps with some of the other advocacy. And I think that lives in tomorrow's conversation around community engagement. We named state and federal advocacy inside those strategies. So I just appreciate the link you gave there around the speed of the growth of the region. Okay. All right, I'm gonna move us on to, I may actually, let's see. we are set. I did not say this at the beginning. I have promised folks a break halfway through these meetings. So we'll take about a 15-minute break at 3:30. I'm curious where folks have energy to go from here. We could continue building out actions around these last two items. It feels like we've gotten into a lot of them already in the first two. With eviction policies, I think it sounds to me like there's more research needed in order to understand what the connection between eviction and housing and homelessness is, and what's the policy changes that may be called for there. But we could also pivot to continue this kind of funding and financing conversation to look over at our conversation around shelter development and permanent supportive housing development as well. Where are folks' wheels turning? It's never good when a facilitator just hands over the reins like that, is it? It's helpful. I'm going to trust my gut and move us over here because I think this helps double check some of our work in a way to look at the two milestones that the city and the county have, through the task force developed to establish adequate shelter for all elderly adults and all young people experiencing housing instability and homelessness. So I think that's an affordable housing, but also just a development question. So it may not squarely live inside this strategy conversation, but I wanted to lift it up here. But also this goal around housing 150 people experiencing chronic homelessness, which is at least a big part of that strategy, is developing more permanent supportive housing, which I know, Amy, is your wheelhouse. So what actions will be necessary across the community to get us to these two milestones in the next 5 years?
I feel like I could do like a whole PowerPoint on the question about developing 150 PSH units. But one thing to mention is that I think we could do both purpose-built permanent supportive housing units and some more scattered site units with like mobile case management, that does keep the development costs down and makes that 150 number feel a little more palatable. Because I do think that 150 is probably a reasonable target for Deschutes County based on the data. But given how much effort is going into developing our first Cleveland Commons with 31 units, it feels like 150 really big goal. So I think, yeah, both the scattered site also have, like, I think the biggest barrier to developing permanent supportive housing is that stable funding for on-site case management. Am I frozen? Because everyone else is frozen. I'm so sorry.
You're frozen, but we can hear you. Oh, now you're unfrozen.
Yeah,
it's kind of coming in and out, but the voice is good.
Okay, I'll go off video, but please interrupt me if you can't hear me. Yeah, I think the biggest hurdle is the stable funding for Medicaid, stable local sources of funding, whether CET or other sources that could bolster Medicaid and other funding sources that go into the support side of it.
On that, I believe that Metro in their bond somehow figured out how to fund services through bond, which I don't know how they did that, but that is sort of a research topic potentially to tack onto what Colleen just said. How do we fund services through bond if we are moving towards this bond someday? How do we fund the services through that? So that might be a research project for the joint office to undertake and figure out how they did it and if we can do that here.
I think it was a separate bond after the affordable housing bond.
Okay,
kind of a
services bond,
Tri-County
got
Metro
it.
effort.
Yeah, I was thinking it was part of the big one, the Metro one, but maybe not. Okay, well, either way, I want to know how.
Yeah.
So we can potentially replicate whatever they did, one way or another.
I think we need to reframe the discussion for this to be successful in the community. I think we need to find a way to make how information is presented to be perceived as more transparent, even though I'm sure it's transparent, but to be perceived as transparent and inclusive for people who even disagree that this is necessary, and just a rebranding. And from a community perspective, 150 beds, it sounds like so few. It sounds like this great idea. And for us, everyone's aware that it is so hard to get there. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity right now if we can just figure out how to talk to each other and how to talk to the community in a way that they can receive.
Well, and I think to be successful, we're really going to have to grow the amount of caseworkers.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even right now, we're just having such a problem, you know, getting new employees.
Yeah.
And retention.
Yeah, I was going to dive in. This is Stacy, and I've been listening the whole time and just wanted to dive in because I think that what's being brought up about the case management is so crucial, because handing someone a key, I think in a lot of people, especially in our house community, thinks that's the answer, and that is a part of it, but it's the retention, the support, and the ongoing relational support that we give to folks once they get into housing that's really going to improve the retention rates and the success that a person experiences once they're in housing. And we talked about this yesterday, as well as, you know, peer supports and ongoing case management. So I think that's a crucial part. And I also think it's I hate to use the word selling point, but I also think it's a great bullet point to our landlords and to our house community that our goal is not just to take someone that might need affordable housing or on the streets and then throw them into housing and let them just sink or swim. And I think that's a huge piece that we really need to address.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if there are structures. Thank you so much, Stacy. I need to pause and just thank you for lifting all of that up. I'm curious if there are structures or community networks of support that are simply not open or not accessible or not inviting or not welcome to people experiencing homelessness. Because so much of what we're talking about here that case managers and providers offer is sense of community. And we've talked a lot about neighborhood associations and their involvement in this. And I'm curious what their role is in creating more community spaces that are open to broader community building than it's been defined before. Not to say that I'm here to move case management to neighborhood groups, but it is about building community connections and community engagement across the board. So I'm just curious, I appreciate you lifting up the need to inform landlords and the house community that that is the intent, but it's also not just a one-way street. And so I'm just curious if there are types of connections or types of community structures, be they community centers or libraries even, can be a common place for community programming. How is that open, welcome, inviting to people experiencing homelessness? Curious if folks have thoughts there.
You know, I'll dive in just because from my experience in Washington State, where I was for 11 years, there was scattered site housing models, and they had often a community person within the building that would invite all of the residents to do kind of social activity types of things. And one of the things that we took note of is so often we heard, oh, you know, we don't want those homeless people here. But the minute we hand someone a key, they're not homeless anymore. Now they're housed and they're part of that community. And I think it's definitely education. And I also think it's offering community-based activities so that people can then gather as people, not as us and them. And so I think that you're right. If we can do that in community settings, if we can have, I don't see a lot of them here, but there are a lot of apartments, and there are some here that have on-site, whether it's I don't know if it's a community relational person or someone on site that can help navigate starting that relationship. Because what we found was once we started it kind of took on a life of its own and it grew in many positive ways. But there needs to be someone that's going to help kind of start the ball rolling and facilitate that. But there are models out there of those programs.
Mhm.
Imagine Housing in Washington State is one of them that really navigated that really quite well.
Thank you so much, Stacy. That's great. Other thoughts around what actions are necessary here? What priorities are necessary? This is a 5-year milestone and we're cementing our 3-year strategies. So it's within that time frame.
Brittany, I think just to sort of answer something that you said about the neighborhood associations, I think council has charged our neighborhood associations with finding ways to be better representative of their community as a whole. So that ask, in my understanding, has already happened. We also have, thank you, Megan. We also have set up oh my gosh, I'm totally, the Equity Commission, I'm spacing on the official name. Somebody help me out.
Human Rights
and
Equity.
Equity. Thank you. And I think that was seen in part as sort of a response, I guess, to sort of the dynamic of power that exists in the city right now and needing to right that a little bit in some way. And so I think that that's part of it. The Affordable Housing Advisory Committee is also tasked with sort of speaking on behalf of the low and moderate income community through sort of the work we do with HUD. Whether we're the most effective, I don't know. But that is one of the other sort of structures, I guess, in place. I think there's more to be done, but did want you to know that some of that work has already started at least.
Great.
I do think a couple things with this. To me, I think political will is really what it comes down to in a lot of this stuff. And I feel like we've been extraordinarily fortunate to have a council that has that political will largely. And so that's part of why we're making strides in this area that we are now. And so that's a piece of it. But I think that that's not just the electeds. It also has to be, and kind of going back to what Amy said about reframing the conversation, there is no location in Bend that people are going to be happy with right now. And I think that's true across the country, right? Like there's so few places that work for people. And so asking our residents to make room one way or another for the needs of our entire community, to me, is really important. I don't know how we do that effectively, but I think that the sort of reset on messaging is the beginning of it.
Mm-hmm. That has come up time and again as a task force priority, which I found super interesting. I think other communities they certainly have as vehement an opposition to homeless services and citing homeless service locations. But that need for public education seems really different, and it may, I'm not sure if this is right, but it may have something to do with the history of the region and its recent growth, whereas other cities have been cities for longer, right? And so understanding their socioeconomic dynamics and navigating them politically for much longer may feed into this. And so I really appreciate that frame of a reset, because it's not informing folks who've had this conversation for 35 years, because folks haven't all lived here for 35 years in Central Oregon. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to pull us into another strategy right before we take a quick break and get down to these last 3 boxes here. But based on where we've gone in the conversation so far, is there anything folks want to add or make sure we prioritize and get to before the end of our time today? Okay. I am going to give folks a 15-minute break. And I'll take a look at the rest of our agenda. I do think that we're going to wrap before 5 in all likelihood. But I want to be respectful and give folks the break too. So I will see you, whoever's able to rejoin, back here at 20 to 4 in about 15 minutes. Thank you all so much.
I have a hard stop at 4:30 for exec session that got scheduled with council. So I will have to drop off a little early. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We'll
Same.
try to wrap. Yeah, I had a feeling that was going to affect you too, Counselor Perkins. So we'll try to wrap up here. Maybe just a short half-hour conversation to wrap us when we come back. Thank you all.
How are you, Patty Wilson? By the way.
I'm not too bad. I'm tired. We have so much going on. It's just been insane.
You guys are busy these days.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to next week when it'll slow down. We're just wrapping up our rental assistance. So
Saw that. Exciting.
So now it's just clean up and, so I'm really happy about that because that's been a big lift.
And are you guys going to apply for the Homeownership Assistance Fund Administration also?
Yes.
Okay, I figured. Good. Somebody needs to, and I don't want to.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. Yes, even though they're cutting the counseling down per hour down or per counseling down, we will do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been a crazy 6 months, I tell you.
Yes.
And
I feel ya.
it seems like it'll just keep going.
I mean, I don't want to complain about the money because that part's good.
Yeah, the money's good. It's just the changing the timelines, We had, we were supposed to have till June 30th to spend out, and then they shortened it to, December 17th. So we got all geared up, did a bunch of exercise, and then, they change it all the time. It's just insane.
Yeah.
It's
Crazy. And then session starting and everything else, like who knows?
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yep. Well, it's good to see your face at least. I never leave the house anymore. I am supposed to have lunch with Sonia tomorrow, I think. And this will literally be the 4th attempt. And it's always something like, it's just like, oh, sick kid. Oh, this is going on. Like, and it's just, I just can't plan anything these days.
Yeah.
It's personal.
Yeah, I agree. So, yeah, glad it's the holidays.
Yes.
All right. I'm also glad it's the holidays. I said today that it feels like December. It feels like 2021 is longer than the entire 21st century so far to date. And December is longer than the rest of this year cumulatively, like is how I'm feeling here on December 15th. I said that before noon today too.
Yeah. Well, and I'm having trouble, remembering what happened actually in 21 versus 20, because it's all like squished together in my mind.
Or like 2019,
Yeah.
Or 2012. I don't know. It sort of all blends at this point for me.
I gave one of our little ones, I tried to play a computer game from when I was a kid. He's home because there's a COVID outbreak at his school. So he's home, and I found one of these Lion King animated storybooks. And we loaded it onto the computer and it wouldn't start. And I said, oh, well, I guess that's what happens when a CD is 17 years old. And I was like, no, 1994 was 27 years ago. There's just so much lost in there.
Yeah.
It was a lot. Anyway, back to it. So I do want to stick to my commitment to wrap us by about 4:15. And I so appreciate how much time folks have committed to this process this week. I know it's been a lot, but I really feel like we're getting really clear on the granular level of actions, or at least what needs to inform those actions as we're drafting them over the next month or so. So I've heard a bit, you see we have kind of 3 boxes left to tap into today through the affordable housing lens. And I know we've touched a bit on eviction policies that are perpetuating homelessness and housing instability. And Lynn, I heard your request for kind of getting clear about what the policy gap is there and what solutions may be out there. Do other folks have thoughts, including you, Lynn? I don't mean to exclude you from offering more there, but do folks have other thoughts on actions or more specific strategies that we may need around eviction prevention? I think there's, this is a space where the arena has very rapidly been changing over the last 2 years, given eviction moratoria and rental assistance. Though I know Oregon has had a lot of trouble deploying rental assistance in response to the eviction moratorium. And so that may be a point of tension, but this may be, eviction prevention may be something that we need to have a bit more of an open set of strategies or actions around in order to accommodate the changing landscape. That's changing probably quicker than it ever has in that specific realm.
I think Oregon actually has done pretty well. I thought we were 4th in the nation on rental assistance out.
My understanding was before the moratorium lifted between kind of June and August. I meant specific to the eviction moratorium and rental assistance. And I think that's when there was no rental assistance getting out in the state before the moratorium was
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But I'm curious, Patty, from your team's perspective, managing the rental assistance program, if there's anything you're learning about eviction prevention or stronger strategies that support folks that are right at the brink there, or navigate the barriers that landlords are facing on the flip side.
Well, I think we find that a lot of people do not communicate well with their landlords. So we're finding that out. So, just education on if you are in trouble, be communicative. And I think it's, I think the landlords are in a really tough position, because if their clients haven't, up until now hadn't reached out for rental assistance, they're out a lot of money. And I think that the system we set up for landlords to receive money was a challenging system to navigate. And of course, it took quite some time to work out all the kinks in Alita. So, it's just been a challenging, 6 months of Alita. And so as far as eviction policies, I'm not sure we've learned anything new lately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, gosh, for me, it always feels hard to separate eviction from just like the larger social safety net and livable wages and affordable rent in general. Like there's like the idea like the rent eats first, and I think that people will spend all that they have on rent, and if they're still getting evicted, I'm thinking like pre-moratorium or it just speaks to like a larger issue of affordability, I think, or like a disconnect between wages and housing costs that feels hard to distill into like any one policy that I would like to see here. Aside from like maybe more education or more like broad public access to information about fair housing or eviction processes or available resources like legal aid or neighbor impact rental assistance. But it's I want to be able to point to at some great policy, but it seems a little bit hard to do.
Mm-hmm. And I know, so with the rental assistance that's particularly tied to Oregon's moratorium, I know the state legislature just put more money behind that this week. Is there anything that the community could use either the joint offices support in or community-wide more support as presumably more rental assistance comes down the pike?
I just think that we need to pay attention on how they're dividing that out throughout the state, because there's a tendency now to really put an emphasis on contracting with nonprofits or community organizations based on communities of color and the BIPOC community. And while I support that, in our area, we don't have a lot of larger nonprofits that would be able to take on a state contract. And so I worry that we will miss out on some funding in our area based on that, and more than their fair share will go to the Portland Metro.
Mhm.
You know.
And I think that,
But, you need to write that in a nicer way than I said it.
well, I think it ties into the conversation we had yesterday about supporting service providers in building capacity, and whether there are ways that the joint office could support recognizing that buy-in for orientation to rental assistance, homeless services, human services more broadly is really important. But that mentorship, fiscal backing, more established nonprofits and 501c3s have a stronger track record. So I am curious how the joint office could support kind of partnerships like that to ensure that the spirit of buy-in for led organizations, or the prioritization is honored, but that they're also getting the support they need.
Yeah.
To execute state level contracts. So I'm also, I'm helping facilitate this state level homeless task force on racial disparities. And so that's something that they'll be talking about as well. And through Build Back Better, more funding targeted to community-based organizations that are buying for BIPOC communities as well. So it's certainly not a one-time infusion of funding. I appreciate that being lifted up. And in our conversations with some folks from the school districts, they named some community-based organizations that should be brought into these conversations as well. So
yeah, I think that more support for those smaller nonprofits would be really key.
I agree. And I think even just training, I don't know how the homeless definition coordinates with the affordable housing definition of what is, a culturally responsive or specific organization. But I can tell you that for the way that it's being defined in the state's QAP, which is how all affordable housing financing is allocated throughout the state, we have 0 organizations that meet the criteria in Central Oregon. And that is an extraordinary concern to me. And so sort of the feedback that we provided to the state is you need to help with technical assistance and training for these folks so that they know what they're supposed to achieve for. Because one of our organizations is probably the leading contender. The executive director would have to step down and find a new one in order for that organization to meet the criteria that the state has set up. And so it's not about supporting equity or not, like we're all there, I feel like. It's about how the state is defining things and whether it's meeting the needs of every, segment of the state, or we are gonna get 0 funding. So I just wanted, I guess, to point that out, Brittany, knowing that you're part of the work on the homeless services section, is that some of the ways that, this is good principle, we should all be achieving this. And at the same time, we're not there yet. And so Central Oregon might get super hosed in how these definitions are being created if we're not at the table.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that Lynn and Patty are giving that feedback to the state also. But at every opportunity that I've had, I've shared that I feel like those definitions are kind of serving to further the urban-rural divide when we just don't have the absolute numbers to merit having a specific organization to serve. I think our point in time count says that there's 5 people who are African-American experiencing chronic homelessness, and there's never going to be an organization that's specific to serving that population here. But yeah, I think could the joint office be a kind of subcontractor somehow, or fiscal sponsor, and adding capacity to these organizations? My feedback to the state was can you just give money and TA to Latino Community Association, or elevate, support these groups that we need to function, so we're not all just reaching out to them whenever we have a grant in a way that feels really disingenuous and awful.
And is there interest from community-based organizations in, have you seen interest despite these barriers? Should the definition be different? Should the organizational limitations be different? Are culturally specific providers or nonprofits interested in stepping into human services and housing support space? That's a genuine question from, there weren't many or any that were a part of the task force. So that's kind of just a question that I wanted to ask of whether there's interest that you all know of.
I think it's hard to ascertain if there's lack of interest or lack of capacity.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
I would have to circle back to Molly in our organizations, but the Latino Association hasn't applied for homeless services with us before. And there's certainly been many opportunities for that.
And just to be clear, that's the organization that would not qualify under the state rules, which might be a little bit fascinating to people, because that is sort of our lead culturally specific organization.
Yeah, that is.
So that's where I'm really concerned. If they don't meet it, nobody's meeting it.
Well, then I'm more concerned than I was 5 minutes ago about missing out in rental assistance for the next round.
Mm-hmm.
If I could maybe kind of shift gears here to, and I apologize if I'm cutting in and out. I'm also commuting my daughter various places this afternoon, but wanted to make sure I participated today. I think it's also super important, and this might be like at a state advocacy level, or I don't know, a code advocacy level, that, you know, we address that the law is reactionary, and what are best practices to prevent displacement or to monitor evictions, because what or how the law is built in place right now, we don't know when people get notices, and we don't know unless they have been educated or they have the tools or the knowledge to you know, raise their legal defense if they have one, or seek resources if they're available. We just miss a lot of people in our safety net just by how our eviction process is developed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is this where the conversation about a rental registry would be placed so we could gather that information? Is that, I'm sorry, I can't read the tiny font. I don't know if we've added that already. Thank you.
You haven't. I'm sorry. I didn't realize it wasn't zoomed in enough. I have a giant screen over here, so I'm so sorry. Yeah, I think that's not in here. I'm sorry. That was the specific language you just used was.
No, and I don't know if this is what Rachel was talking about, but to get that information, there would need to be a more formalized, some kind of rental registry.
Mm-hmm.
So we would know how many units are available, how many units are occupied. And then part of that would be the requirement that they would say if somebody had been evicted, and it might be a way to correlate whether people are getting services or not able to get services with the actual numbers. But I don't think we have any way now of determining how many people have been evicted.
And do evictions go through the county level court system? And
we monitor the docket. Well, we had been up till this week. Now we don't have assistants, so hopefully we'll have more in January.
sorry, now you don't have.
We spent out our rental assistance this week.
And the problem lies within, before it even goes to court, someone gets a notice, and that notice they can act on without even like going to court. The person can move or get out and not even realize what's available to them. Mm-hmm. And as much as like that's the kind of displacement we want to avoid, and there's no safety net to avoid that.
I see.
This
Well-
might be a dumb question, but in the same way that we're required to share information about like lead-based paint hazards at move-in, is that anything that like at the city level could be required of landlords to share with tenants at the start of their tenancy? And that question might not be based in reality.
At the start of tenancy is an interesting question, because the rental assistance and the supports aren't necessarily going to be available, though it could be information that could be shared that where a landlord is simply pointing tenants to Deschutes County for more information on what types of services and supports, be it legal assistance or rental assistance, are available. And I think the moratorium, as the moratoriums expire, that's an opportunity for information to be required upon or prior to eviction at the reverse end of that. Has there been work around legal assistance or legal representation in addition to rental assistance, or has it just been primarily focused on rental assistance throughout the pandemic?
Well, when we have clients that are having trouble, we will refer to legal aid, but it's not part of our wheelhouse.
Legal aid isn't getting a part of that assistance package. Okay.
And legal aid only represents people who make below federal poverty guidelines.
Right.
So that's a pretty limited population.
Mm-hmm.
And this may be about standing up. I mean, not just finding the people, that's step one, but standing up a program, because legal aid is so above capacity. They do great work and we need to support them ongoing. But I also think that whether it's kind of encouraging another program that even goes beyond legal aid, because there are a lot of like landlord tenant type workshops and pro bono services in other communities as well. I'm not familiar if we have any here beyond legal aid. I don't know of them other than like lawyer in the library, which is not time appropriate for what we're looking at.
I thought that the Fair Housing Council of Oregon hired a Deschutes County-based representative. And I know that the Community Alliance of Tenants for a long time had an open posting for Deschutes County, or two different positions in Deschutes County, and that they had held 1 or 2 meetings to strategize with Deschutes County tenants about what their priorities should be. So I guess a bullet point could be some kind of collaboration with CAT or the Community Alliance of Tenants or the Fair Housing Council of Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
There may be some efforts to bring the ROC out here too, the Housing Alliance's resident group also. So yeah, maybe broadly tenant groups or something like that, or tenant support or something.
Yeah. And I think
And
that's
those,
yeah, go ahead.
those fair housing groups and Community Alliance of Tenants, they don't do actual legal representation so much as outreach and education.
Mm. That's helpful. It feels like that may be less enshrining an action around that collaboration and more doing some outreach as we're working on the actions to figure out what their needs are and what their advocacy would be around with this. I think that's probably some outreach we can do before we finalize the actions. Okay. I want to move us to the housing stability and assistance programs. This, I feel like we lifted up a lot of this. I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to zoom out just a little bit so we can see up the top. From earlier today, it feels like when we talked a bit about prioritization, LIHTC set-asides, we're talking about more opportunities for housing assistance programs. I'm curious if folks have more ideas around actions to encourage workforce participation by preventing displacement through housing stability and assistance programs. Any other actions that we haven't named today that we would want to hit on here? I'll zoom back in because I can see folks straining.
I think we kind of talked about this, but we just don't do much on displacement. And this may have been part of where Rachel was going. There's not a lot to be done other than analysis that I've seen cities do, honestly. Analysis or some form of funding to kind of help with relocation or whatever. But I think it's something to just sort of have in mind. How do we prevent displacement when possible?
Mm-hmm.
Is this talking about our displacement like outside of the commute shed, or like so people are commuting longer into their commute into Bend, or is it talking about like people just giving up and leaving the state, or both? I guess I'd be curious. I feel like some studies have been done about commute times into Bend and where people are living, where they're working.
And I guess I'm thinking of it, what I just said, more even within cities also. I mean, knowing that if somebody loses their housing in Bend, they might be commuting from a much farther place or moving out of the area right now. But for me, that's part of it too, is even within the city, as well as sort of larger displacement. I don't know, Brittany, if I was looking at that wrong, we can take off my little sticky.
No, I think it's both. I think it's preventing displacement from within Bend and also preventing displacement outside the commuting shed. I think where this came up, or where one of the ties here is actually right above it, the buy-in for BIPOC community-based organizations, understanding a little bit more clearly what displacement looks like for communities that have been here but are starting to shrink, and getting a deeper understanding of what those community advocacy organizations are looking for as far as housing assistance, and housing stability and support programs. So this does feel like a bit of some higher level strategies to better understand what's happening with displacement. Because oftentimes, you know, when the state legislature prioritizes BIPOC-led or BIPOC organizations, they're often doing that under a frame of targeted universalism, or seeking to understand how to center racial equity in policy development. And oftentimes the best way to do that is to actually just understand what those most significant needs are that BIPOC communities are facing at these intersections, because addressing those needs and prioritizing those disparities will therefore support everyone. And so these strategies wind up coming back up in prioritization conversations. And I think loop us back into how we think about voucher prioritization, set-asides, et cetera. So that was a roundabout that was connecting a lot of different pieces, but it feels like without a lot of displacement work already underway, it is going to be the higher level research, understanding what's happening with displacement, which I think connects back into deeper case management services or broader case management services being available to understand the realities of people experiencing homelessness and the barriers they face individual by individual across the community, to understand whether these are displacement dynamics that are unfolding, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of tie-ins here. And as we hash out these actions, I am curious if this is something that becomes more of an action or a couple of actions under another strategy than a standalone strategy here. But I'm open to pushback too if none of that tracks for folks. I went a lot of different places with a lot of different connections.
If we're going to talk about displacement, we also have to talk about foreclosure prevention and preservation. So we have a preservation lending program that we loan funds to people to be able to stay in their houses. You know, so if they need health and safety things like roofs and things like that, and they don't fit into our weatherization program, you know, because I could get the actual stats, but you know, typically our client in our preservation lending department is elderly, has, you know, owned their house forever, but doesn't have the income to get traditional lending to be able to replace roofs and stuff. And so we do a lot of work in that area through our weatherization program and our lending department.
Mhm. That's really helpful.
And I do need more applications for weatherization, Lynn, if you know anyone.
I feel like I hear about so much of that in Lapine. Is there like resources for that in Lapine? I guess neighbor impact.
Through us, yes.
Really?
Yeah.
And the legislature just gave the county more this week. So there's clean water funds in Lapine also. That's a piece of it. But
We have the sewer program.
we could do it
feel
in
like
Bend, but there's less need here, like in the city proper, just because our housing is so new. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's CDBG money that you could use, but
It's the where we get it in Bend is the older neighborhoods that have to go and hook up to sewer. And so we do a lot of preservation loans to that population, and those tend to be elderly or older adults that have owned their houses for years.
I feel like I don't know if this fits into the set of priorities at all, but the displacement that my peers and I are so familiar with is just the housing market being so hot right now in Bend, so many long-term rentals being sold out from under households. I don't know that that's happening as much in like the multifamily units, but that it is something that like I've lost a handful of peers recently and know of so many people who have been displaced due to like a home sale of a rental. And I don't know that that would fall into these categories or is anything that anybody here doesn't already know about. But
I hear quite a bit through my children's friends that Airbnb, the rentals are converting into Airbnbs as well.
I guess that's like earlier I mentioned the demand side of housing policy, and I'm just wondering if what there's space for to tackle in this context as far as like that type of, yeah, I see that often with friends' houses, and honestly, like I live in constant fear of that, of my landlord someday deciding to sell. But it's hard to feel connected to the future of Bend, like despite my privilege. I just can't imagine like the clients we're serving and for more marginalized communities, just like the emotional tax of like needing that housing stability when it's not available.
Yeah. And what's happened in Seattle, Lynn, I'm curious if the mid-market strategies address this juncture at all. Real quick, I'll offer that in Seattle, when we looked at the housing affordability study in 2019, which was before all of our markets went in directions we completely did not expect, or maybe it was 2018 that the study was done. 2019 was when we said the market in Seattle is not slowing down anytime soon. And then the pandemic just accelerated that aggressively. But what we saw is down market rentals and folks who are at 80% AMI renting at 60% AMI, and that affecting availability for mid-market housing as well. That shift, that down market shift happening. I am probably using the wrong words there. I see Lynn nodding, so I'm not like speaking a totally different language, but that was part of the dynamics that happened when folks are no longer renting at what they can afford because of the instability at that level is certainly something that we've seen unfold here in Seattle. But Lynn, I'm curious if the mid-market strategies capture this at all.
Sort of. I mean, I will tell you that in Bend right now, Bend proper, over 26% of our renters are severely rent burdened. So paying more than 50% of gross income each month towards housing. So it is absolutely pervasive. We know that that's concentrated at the lower income levels, but Colleen is, in my opinion, absolutely council's target. You are our target market for the incentives that we are developing for middle income housing. But there's not a lot. I mean, honestly, like what I told council and I'm telling everybody is like in a functioning housing market, you don't need middle income incentives. Like our system is broken. And that is the only reason we are talking about this is because we have failed to provide what we need to provide. And so I have, I think, 400,000 in my discretion that we are working on getting out the door. That is, you know, nothing plus potentially tax exemptions or whatever. And so it's not a lot that we have to work with. So I'm not, I mean, I feel like it's good. It's all going to be good, but it's not going to get us there. And Brittany, I can't tell, sorry, I was trying to do 46 things at once. If you're talking about filtering more or less where housing is built at a higher cost and then sort of eventually loses some value over time and becomes more expensive, the same thing is true to some degree with people. And yes, everybody is paying more than they can for rent right now, and that's what we're seeing. So I do think that middle income housing strategies free up some of those units for lower income people who are still going to be paying too much, but at least there's space. And then also kind of the idea is getting everybody in the house or home that they need that fits their budget and needs. And that in Bend just means more of everything. We don't have a lot of really small units. We don't have a lot of like gigantic units for, you know, large families. There's kind of like a whole bunch of 2 bedrooms that are all taken up. If that makes sense. So
yeah. And then Brittany, I want to clarify that for our weatherization program, we don't need an increase in funds because we're getting, our budget is doubling right now. I just need more clients.
Yeah, I meant
okay,
in that direction.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure that
So
the joint office didn't find me additional money for that foreclosure prevention. I can always use money, but
yeah, that's helpful. Or that difference between weatherization and foreclosure prevention is super helpful. Something that we talked about on Monday in the strategy and the service strat, I just keep throwing, if a word starts with the same letter, I'm just mixing them up today. In our conversation around services on Monday, we talked about the milestone around prevention and diversion. And those are the kinds of resources that we'd love to see further upstream at prevention. So when folks are, say, behind on a utility bill, this is the kind of process that other communities that have broader and more robust homeless service systems try to do. When someone's behind on a utility bill, that actually flags outreach that offers related resources like weatherization or foreclosure prevention to assess, you know, you're behind on your utility bill. That often signals that you're about to be behind somewhere else or something else is straining your budget. And so that's kind of why I say increase access, kind of increase visibility of the programs and access back and forth.
Well, we do run the energy assistance program. So when they are behind in their bill, we do connect them to other services that we provide. You know, weatherization and our, you know, home source department.
I did commit to wrapping us up right around here today. Anything, you know, one more call. Is there anything we didn't get to today that folks hoped that we would tack onto our actions list? I think this, the milestone around establishing adequate shelter is one that came up around unsheltered homelessness on Monday, and we got into quite a bit. There are probably some more actions to hammer out there, but it's okay that we didn't get there today. Anything else that folks wanted to make sure we're flagging or recognizing? Hey, Rachel. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your time. This has been tremendously helpful. I appreciate you, the degree to which you've all helped me along from my homeless services expertise into some of this affordable housing conversation to understand where the joint office and the community needs to be prioritizing efforts in the next 3 years. So this has been super helpful to map out. Stay tuned for chances to review and give feedback and edit these actions as we flesh them out over the next month or so. And for those of you that are joining tomorrow, I will see you at our last action planning meeting on community engagement. And if you won't be, I will do my best to share as I'm able from one conversation to another. Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Bye.